Okay, a brief run through the philosophy of symbolic forms by Ernst Cassirer, published in 1929. The principal ideas of which are that the mind creates symbols to interpret the data of experience. To understand knowledge and the significance of science, it is necessary to understand the function of symbolic forms in explanations. Forms of cognition are affected by language and myth. Language, myth, and science are all forms of human experience. Experience begins with the immediacy of feelings, but as living creatures respond in accordance with their needs, certain items in their experience take on sign and symbol functions. In the phase which follows, the distinction between self and non-self becomes fixed. The flux of sensations is recognized and ordered into things by the use of names, and space and time are conceived. Philosophy becomes the criticism of language, and religion becomes the criticism of myth. Ernst Cassirer was one of the few men with sufficient breadth of scholarship to undertake the task of synthesizing the findings of 20th century science. He wrote authoritatively on the history of ideas and on the methodology of the sciences, as well as on literature, politics, and primitive culture. The philosophy of symbolic forms is his masterwork, in which he attempts to give a systematic view of the entire range of human achievement. Thoroughly at home in the fields of biology and physics, Cassirer nevertheless turned his back on the more unusual type of synthesis. For example, A. N. Whitehead's Process and Reality, also of 1929, which takes nature as ultimate and seeks to interpret man in terms of cosmic evolution. For Cassirer, modern science is more interesting for what it reveals to us about the mind of the scientist than for the information it discloses to us about an alleged material universe. In his synthesis, science is viewed as a cultural phenomenon, the more advanced condition of mind since its emergence from preconscious animal existence. His survey is primarily a philosophy of culture. It traces the evolution of mind rather than the evolution of nature, and indeed gives nature a place among the contents of mind. In short, Cassirer's synthesis is in the idealistic rather than in the realistic tradition. Cassirer's philosophical lineage is easily traced. He was a member of a group known as the Marburg School, after the university where it flourished, which was dedicated to bring up to date the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Kant had never completely broken with the belief that reality is prior to and independent of our knowledge of it. The Marburg group considered this belief inconsistent with Kant's own principles and carried through the thesis that nothing is real except what is given in experience. They employed Kant's transcendental method and sought by the analysis of perception, judgment, and arguments to uncover the structure of the intellect which makes knowledge possible. Although Cassirer always worked in this tradition, he went well beyond others of the group. In an important respect, it has been characteristic of the successors of Kant to be preeminently concerned with epistemology or the theory of knowledge. Cassirer came to believe that knowledge is only one aspect of the mind's activity, and he argued that if we are to understand our experience, either our immediate perceptions or scientific hypotheses, we must familiarize ourselves with the development of language and with mythical thought, as well as with the processes of sensation, perception, and a judgment. According to Cassirer, language, myth, and knowledge are three distinct but overlapping frontiers on which the human spirit has advanced in its effort to bring under its power the chaos of organic feelings. Forms of perception such as space, time, and number, together with concepts such as substance, attribute, and causality, all have their origins in primitive symbols, images, and acts. Not only our knowledge of the world, but our consciousness of ourselves as well, presupposes the unfolding and articulation of these forms, and such order and intelligibility as we find in our experience is, in actuality, the order which consciousness in its long development has itself created. In this modified form, the Kantian thesis is no longer dependent on a merely theoretical deduction. As Cassirer has stated it, it is an empirical hypothesis to be verified by reference to the findings of students in the fields of linguistics and of cultural anthropology. There is in the 3 volumes of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Language, Mythical Thoughts, and the Phenomenology of Knowledge, a minimum of the kind of abstruse reasoning which characterizes the Critique of Pure Reason. Instead, the author offers us a compendium of modern knowledge in the 3 fields. Cassirer first developed the notion of symbolic forms in connection with his studies in the mythology of the sciences in his Substance and Function of 1910. He maintained that the ordinary view of knowledge, according to which scientific concepts and laws reproduce the actuality of things experienceable by the senses, is disproved by the developments of modern physics. He agreed with the mathematicians and scientists who said that mathematical symbols and such physical concepts as mass, energy, and the atom are not empirical facts in the same sense that light, heat, and electricity are, but are instruments of the intellect which make it possible for us to correlate and order these more immediate aspects of our experience. The problem for the philosopher, according to Cassirer, is to explore the connection between the scientific explanation and the data which it illuminates. Both the range and the precision of the exact sciences derive from the purely formal character of their constructions. How, then, can we account for the agreement between the theories and our actual experience? Kant's approach seemed to point to the answer. The mind does indeed create new symbols to interpret the data of experience. But in so doing, it only carries further the same activity in which it has been engaging since the dawn of consciousness. All our experience has its structures in virtue of the creativity of the mind. An example is the perception of things in space. The vital feelings of earliest men did not include the notion of 3-dimensional or any other variety of space. Even among so-called primitive peoples today, a mythical view of space prevails which lacks the universal, homogeneous character that space has for us. Space, in other words, is a symbolic form by which evolving consciousnesses imposes unity upon the manifold of concrete intuition, and though the higher geometries seem quite to transcend intuition, still they carry with them something of our common spatial representation. Thus it is not altogether surprising that they have proved useful for correlating new fields of experimental data. The exact sciences bring knowledge to its highest perfection and provide a capital instance of the role of symbols. A philosopher with fewer universal interests than Cassirer might have stopped with this insight, but the fact that forms of cognition are intertwined with those of language and myth suggested to him the answer to another long-standing problem of philosophy, namely that of the relation between man's quest for knowledge and his concern with religion, morality, and art. At this point, the philosophy of symbolic forms ceased to be merely a philosophy of science and was projected into a philosophy of culture, in which language and mythology would be treated not simply as stages on the way to knowledge, but as divergent and as independent, though supplementary, ways in which man had raised himself above the animals and become the monarch of all he surveys. Cassirer went considerably beyond Kant somewhat in the manner of Hegel. He spoke of his philosophy as a phenomenology of spirit in the manner of Hegel, to whose phenomenology of spirit he often refers. For both Cassirer and Hegel, history is the story of man's emerging awareness of himself and of his growing freedom and autonomy. They differed in that Hegel conceived the essence of spirit to be reason, from which he concluded that all aspects of culture were related to one another in a logical fashion and found their consummation in pure knowledge. For Cassirer, in step with the pragmatic temper of his time, reason took its place as one functions among other. Hence he did not follow the dialectic part of Hegel's philosophy, or suppose that there is any rational or logically necessary connection between language, myth, and science. As a result, he was less tempted than Hegel to sacrifice the autonomy of art, religion, morality, and other aspects of experience to any one master science, and he remained closer to the position of Kant. Nevertheless, according to Cassirer, there is a fundamental unity running through all modes of experience. Language, myth, and science are all forms of expression, and governing the internal development of each of these is a kind of law of 3 stages, which Cassirer claimed as the high point of his philosophy. In a way, it too is a kind of dialectic, although much less rigid than Hegel's. As Cassirer viewed it, the first phase in the development of any branch of experience is characterized by immediacy, when consciousness has not yet distinguished clearly between subject and object. The symbol by means of which consciousness succeeds in arresting a portion of the flux is as much a feeling as it is something felt. It has not yet become a medium by which the self responds to the environment, because at this level the vital adjustment is so spontaneous and automatic that no distinction is made between one and the other. Cassirer drew upon the findings of biology and of animal and infant psychology to reinforce the evidence of cultural anthropology in these matters. He was impressed by the view that each animal species lives in a world of its own, which is schematized for it in accordance with its particular organic needs. Function determines form. That is to say, the form under which the world appears to have any living creature. The function determines form, that is to say, the form under which the world appears to any living creature. The difference between a sign and a symbol, according to Cassirer, is that the former stands in a one-to-one relationship with the thing signified, whereas the latter has achieved a more universal reference. In terms of function, the sign is an immediate stimulus to the organism and normally leads to a specific response, but the symbol breaks the receptor-effector arc and either waylays consciousness or sends it along a detoured route. In either case, a radical innovation has taken place. A particular feeling no longer merely exists, it has become freighted with meaning. With this change, Cassirer argues consciousness is on the way to becoming self-conscious. Still, in the first phase, as has been indicated, a large measure of immediacy remains. Cassirer, for example, is partly Cassirer explains, for instance, that gesture, for example, is partly an expression of feeling, partly an imitative act, and partly a conventional designation of, say, consent. That is gesture. So, presumably, was earliest speech. Such must also have been the condition when myth arose, which has for its province the realm of imagination. The hunter, for example, no longer merely recognized his prey, its image took on magical powers for him. But, as the totemic structure of earlier society suggests, this occurred without a clear distinction being made between the hunter and the hunted. Knowledge, as distinct from language and myth, is rooted in sensation and properly emerges as the mind gradually discriminates between the external and internal senses and between sense contents and affective tones. In contrast with the usual empiricist account of experience, Cassirer held that sensations are not given as discrete elements of experience, but are abstracted by the mind from a congeries of emotions and feelings. They are thus early symbolic forms and are peculiarly immediate, especially those which, like smell and touch, can be identified even by the sophisticated mind, either with the self or with the object. Once it has begun the use of symbols, consciousness evolves by a kind of necessity. Since symbols by their very nature introduce a break into the immediacy of the vital activity, it is inevitable that the break will compound itself. The second phase in this development is characterized by mediacy. At this stage, the distinction between the self and the non-self becomes fixed. According to Cassirer, the knowledge of objects precedes the knowledge of the self. Only after consciousness has succeeded in dividing and ordering the world of things is it possible for it to form any notion of an inner, subjective realm. This is achieved in large measure through the fixation that language and myth make possible. The flux of sensations is ordered into things endowed with independent, substantial existence. This is largely the function of naming. Space and time, which have their origin in mythical imagination, also contribute to the ordering and differentiation of the world. No sharp distinction is made, however, between fact and fancy. Mythical images are reified as well as sensible ones. It was a happy moment in the history of mind when the symbol could be identified with the thing which it symbolized, a kind of honeymoon between life and spirit. But it could not last. With the discovery of the role of mind in creating symbols and the role of symbols in determining any world representation, man necessarily entered a third level of consciousness. This took place as far as a language is concerned, at the beginning of philosophy, when the magical connection between the thing and its name was dissolved and man's attention directed to the ideal and functional character of speech. A similar process took place in the world of myth. According to Cassirer, religion developed from mythology when the distinction became clear between the sensible image and that which the image reveals, opening therewith a new dimension in which the norms of myth and magic were no longer valid. It is in the realm of knowledge that man has been slowest to recognize the creative activity of the intellect and the symbolic elements in truth. The Pythagorean Galilean revolution, which overthrew the world of sense perception, only strengthened the conviction that the intelligible aspects of the world are real and eternal. Only the most modern developments prepare us to accept the ideality of space and time and the functional origin of our concepts of causality and law. The dialectical movement within the symbol-using consciousness served as the underlying principle for Cassirer's system. Because it is purely formal, it enabled him to view experience of the most diverse kinds as all manifestations of the same fundamental activity. He maintained that this is the basic difference between a critical philosophy, such as his own, and the traditional metaphysical systems, which raise one or another objective content of experience to the level of a first principle. The philosophy of symbolic forms does not, like that of Hegel, start with rational necessity, much less like that of Marx with material necessity. For Cassirer, rational necessity is itself purely formal. When mind works with logical concepts, it must, to achieve its purpose, follow the connections that are entailed in symbols of this kind. The same thing is true of physical necessity. The kind of order which the mind has imposed on the physical world includes causality. A defect of all metaphysical explanation, according to Cassirer, is that beginning with an abstract concept of unity, it is compelled to explain all multiplicity and hence also all knowledge as illusory. He claimed as the singular merit of his philosophy the fact that it does not suppress any kind of experience. Myth is just as legitimate as mathematics, and aesthetic feeling is not inferior to scientific fact. They merely lie along different axes, and they may represent earlier or later moments in the evolution of form, but one variety of experience is intrinsically no more valuable than another. On the other hand, though all experiences are in a sense equal, they do, on this hypothesis, fit into one another to make up a meaningful universe. And this, according to Cassirer, is something that most empirical and positivist philosophy have not been able to encompass. The mistake that is found in these philosophies is their initial claim that experience is composed of discrete sensations and feelings. According to his critical analysis, such is not the case. The least sense content we are capable of discriminating is part of a preformed whole. If this fact is admitted, it resolves the difficulty which has always defeated empiricism's efforts to explain how independent parts can come together to form meaningful unities. How, for example, 5 separate sounds can form a musical theme or an intelligible sentence. For Cassirer, who has as his starting point not the contents of the mind, but the form of the mind as it expresses itself, the musical theme or the intelligible sentence is given first, and on accurate analysis, the structure of the whole is found to be implicit in any of the parts. Like Kant, Cassirer left his system open. He did not claim that its analysis is able to reduce experience entirely to intelligible components. At the lower end, sense contents always remain as a limit, in spite of the fact that any feeling or content taken up into consciousness is already touched with meaning. At times he was not averse to speaking of the lower animals as life. At times he was not averse to speaking of the lower limits as life, and he showed some sympathy with Henry Bergson's philosophy, but he regarded as futile all mystical attempts to know this prime condition by direct intuition, and any attempt to inquire about it in terms of higher symbols, such as those employed by biology or sociology, would, on his view, be self-defeating. The most that he claimed for his system was that it provided a morphology of consciousness in the act of expressing itself. His system was also open in the direction of intellect. While he recognized the need for consciousness to become even more aware of its main creativity, he did not venture to suggest that the consummation was yet in sight, or indeed that there ever would be a conditioned, perfectly self-contained consciousness. In this respect, the philosophy of symbolic forms invites contrast with Hegel's philosophy of spirit. The latter was governed by a logical a priori, which, when it had been once disclosed itself, left nothing further to discover. Thus Hegel's works all bear the impress of finality, but the a priori element in Cassirer's system is multiform and complex. Spirit develops in many directions, each of which manifests its own pattern. All that can be said with assurance is that there is always a tendency toward greater freedom of spirit and form, and away from subservience to matter and sense. For Cassirer, a world of pure form and intelligibility is unthinkable. Symbolic forms range along a scale, some dominantly sensible, others dominantly intelligible, but no form, no object which consciousness can entertain can be completely without its sensible existential component, any more than it can be without the structural intelligible part which gives its meaning. Cassirer's attempts to account for the evolution of culture without reference to natural events, to such matters as climate, geography, economics, and politics, has brought criticism, much as Hegel's system provoked reaction among some of his followers. But Cassirer did not deny that other things besides consciousness influence man's development. He only maintained that any attempt to know them involves us in the use of a symbolic system which may or may not give a valid account of what comes to pass. With good reason, his philosophy has been hailed as a humanist answer to culturologists and economic determinists who subject man to natural laws. If Cassirer is right, nature holds no domination over man other than that which man thinks it holds. At a certain stage of his intellectual development, he is likely to attribute to objects of reality an independence which they do not possess, and submit himself to their bondage. His hope lies in the fact that sooner or later he is bound to throw off this yoke of dogmatism and myth. When he does, and becomes fully aware of the creative uses of symbols, new vistas will open before him. This is not to say that life may not perish before the goal is realized, or that, unsettled by advancing knowledge and the loss of earlier certitudes, man may not destroy himself. Two works written by Cassirer in exile from his native Germany during World War II, An Essay on Man of 1944, and The Myth of the State, 1946, represent civilization as a fragile bark, afloat on stormy deeps, which we must make a positive effort to save. His tone, however, remained hopeful, much like that of the 18th century Enlightenment, whose heir he was.